Hi everyone, welcome to Solid Ground, this 101st episode. Look, great to have you all back. A quick heads up, this is actually a pre-record this morning, and I will explain why in a moment. So I'm sorry to say this is not live. So as a consequence, I'm not going to be able to see your comments coming through. Well, not at the time. Know that actually a few hours after this is shown, I'll be able to jump online onto the internet and look at all your comments and read them. But look, welcome again to Solid Ground. And for newbies watching, or first-time viewers and watchers, Solid Ground is where I talk about the cultural and political, the social, the ethical, or just curious happenings. From a conservative point of view, a solid ground, if you will, which of course is a pun around also a good cup of coffee. So welcome to the show. Regulars know that normally if you're on the Family First Facebook or YouTube channel, your comments come directly to me here in the studio. But the reason this morning's pre-record is that I'm actually in Australia at the moment for a funeral. My auntie on my father's side, she's into her 90s, passed away. And she was a pretty special lady, as actually aunts and uncles, but she was very close to my dad, and he's passed away as well. So I felt it important to come across for the funeral, and that's today. And just with time zones and commitments, it just wasn't possible for me to do this live. So there we go. Full disclosure, not a live show, but still very much up to date. Secondly, a big thank you to everyone who joined me for the 100th episode 2 days ago on Tuesday. That for me was quite a special occasion, not just because we've reached 100 episodes, because when you start these things, you never quite know what is and is not going to happen, whether it will take off and succeed, which it has. But also it was a chance, certainly for me, to be thankful not only to each and every one of you who are part of this show, part of this community, part of the wider Family First community, but thankfulness to that Family First crew, particularly to Bob, of course, who's the founder and the person who drives us all along. I want to be clear about drives us along, not drives us mad, before some wit wants to add something. Bob is very much not only probably one of the, if not the strongest conservative voices out there for family, for life. But it was just someone with a lot of inspiration. So that's why Tuesday, that 100th episode, was so special. And thank you all for your lovely messages. So look, today there's a few things I want to touch on. I'm actually going to show you a clip in a moment from a guy called Brett Weinstein. Some of you might know him. He's a former evolutionary biologist and now podcaster. And he was recently on the Joe Rogan show. So I've got about a minute of video from him because he had something which I think is a fairly profound insight. And so I'll show the video, obviously, share your thoughts. As I say, well, I can't get them directly today. I will be able to get to them within a few hours. In other words, I won't be able to comment live, but I'll certainly see your comments. But he has some quite profound insights around, well, basically, not just the change in family structure, that people are delaying marriage, delaying kids or not having kids, but how that, if you will, energy is being redirected. And it was one of those, not quite a eureka moment for me, but a moment I went, you know what, actually, I think this is a correct observation. So I said, I'll play that video. As I say, I don't actually know Weinstein particularly well. I mean, I've never met the man. I'm aware from a little bit of research that some of his views on a few things are not quite aligned, certainly with mine. But on this, I think he's right. But anyway, you be the judge. I'll just play that. In fact, what I'm going to do is just play the whole video so you don't have to be looking at me the whole time. But yeah, this is on the Joe Rogan show.
Happened is, well, frankly, I'm going to connect it to the sexual revolution. Right? The sexual revolution creates the opportunity to get one of the most profound rewards, in fact, the most profound reward that the universe has ever produced, as far as we know, without having to invest very much work at all, right? So by making sex common, it totally altered the way people viewed the number of years they had to live, right? They could afford to put off child rearing, right? It could be distant in the future, which left all of these young people with all of this energy who might well not have been involved in movements if they were struggling to, raise a family. But because the family part has been put off so long, right, it is considered abnormal to marry early. It is considered normal not to. What people do is they take the energy, the seriousness of purpose that would ordinarily be directed into managing a marriage and the role of being a parent, and they put it into something. And Heather has pointed out that this is especially powerful with young women who seem to take on causes, and they defend them like a mother defending her child. That's a very powerful force. And the point is, if the idea is, well, climate change is a threat, and your role here on Earth is to make sure that that threat is addressed, and you put the mama bear energy into your climate change work, well, that's pretty frightening, especially if climate change isn't the threat that it's been made out to be, right? You have a large number of mama bears doing this ferocious work, and there's a question about what it even is, whether that's even in the top 10 list of concerns we ought to have.
Should unmute myself. So there you have it. I said Brett Weinstein, an evolutionary biologist who left his faculty. I've forgotten why, but I just thought that was a fairly profound set of insights. And I say you may have a different view. I may play it again in a moment, but a couple of comments. Firstly, Heather, I'm pretty sure that he refers to as his wife. But his basic premise is that since the sexual revolution, sex has become common. In fact, it no longer needs to be within a stable monogamous relationship. It's common, it's a cheap commodity, and consequently it's been detached from, procreation or having kids. Now, that's not to say that everyone has to have kids. As you'll know, I'm a step parent. I haven't had kids myself. It's not an absolute prerequisite for marriage, without getting into the depths of covenantal and marriage theology. But long and short, he's just saying that basically we've divorced sex from a notion of a family, monogamy, and it's just become common, anytime, anyone, for any reason. Whereas in the past, before the sexual revolution, having children was a pretty common activity. I think he went on later on the show too to talk about abortion as part of that as well. The fact that even if people do have children now, they can be terminated and removed. And so, as I understand it, and as I say, I'll play it again because you might find it interesting second time round. I had to listen to it a few times. He's saying, sexual revolution, sex is now common, anyone, anywhere, and no worries about the consequences. Mainly there isn't children, but if there are, they can be aborted. And therefore you have a lot of either single or partnered people with no children, and that actually, instead of the energies being directed to raising that child, the energies, if you will, are being pushed into political issues. And he used climate change as an example. But I think why it resonated with me is all around us. I think we do see these mama bears, as he references, and dada bears. If you want, it's not actually a sex issue or a gender issue, depending on what term you want to use. I think sex is the correct one. All that energy, that ferocious energy that he talks about, is being pushed into political causes and reflected with an intensity that you would see of a mother or a father projecting their child. So it's almost as if we've made a switch, is what he's saying. Instead of our efforts, time and energy going into raising children, maintaining our relationships, we're now taking that energy into political causes. And I would add further to what he says, it's probably why we're seeing the fracturing of social cohesion here as well. Again, that ferocious energy, and I just love that phrase, that ferocious energy is actually making people very black and white, very determined on certain causes, and in turn that's separating from people who have the same ferocious energy but in a different direction. So I just think really, really fascinating. So I'm going to play it again because again I think it's profound. I know I keep coming to that word, but every so often you hear something from someone that I think you go, that makes sense. It was like when I interviewed, Grant was on RCR a few months back, a sociologist from America, Masa Al-Ghabi, who talked about the woke dynamics, and long and short, that the young ones today with degrees, and I'm paraphrasing here, degrees that aren't worth the paper they're written on, are competing with one another for fewer and fewer roles. And so they have to be the loudest, shrill activist to be heard, and you can see how that then spirals, particularly on social media. He would say as they speak, they have to be the more aggressive, the louder, the more out there to garner attention. But it also comes with all the hypocrisy that they're relying often on the very causes that they're fighting against. And the example we were using is all the protests in the United States at the moment around migration and attacking what they call the ICE, the federal agents who are deporting immigrants. So you've got all these ferocious mama and dada bears out there protesting against against removing the migrants, and yet they go back to their homes where migrants are actually cleaning their pools and doing their cooking and baking and so forth, running the Ubers and others, and they're actually benefiting financially from that. Sort of that contradiction that he was highlighting, or the other would be the defund the police, like the BLM movements and so forth, defund the police, but at the same time they retreat back to their houses with high walls and cameras and private security. So it's that inherent contradiction. But I was just reminded again of that listening to this Brett Weinstein. And again, I'll play his video, and I say put your comments in, both on YouTube and Facebook. I'll get to read them later. I just can't respond to them right now, but I'd be really interested to see whether this resonates with you in the same way it did for me.
And what I think has happened is, well, frankly, I'm going to connect it to the sexual revolution. Right? The sexual revolution creates the opportunity to get one of the most profound rewards, in fact, the most profound reward that the universe has ever produced, as far as we know, without having to invest very much work at all. Right? So by making sex common, it totally altered the way people viewed the number of years they had to live. Right? They could afford to put off child rearing. Right? It could be distant in the future, which left all of these young people with all of this energy who might well not have been involved in movements if they were struggling to, raise a family. But because the family part has been put off so long, right, it is considered abnormal to marry early. It is considered normal not to. What people do is they take the energy, the seriousness of purpose that would ordinarily be directed into managing a marriage and the role of being a parent, and they put it into something. And Heather has pointed out that this is especially powerful with young women who seem to take on causes, and they defend them like a mother defending her child. That's a very powerful force. And the point is, if the idea is, well, climate change is a threat, and your role here on Earth is to make sure that that threat is addressed, and you put the mama bear energy into your climate change work, well, that's pretty frightening, especially if climate change isn't the threat that it's been made out to be, right? You have a large number of mama bears doing this ferocious work, and there's a question about what it even is, whether that's even in the top 10 list of concerns we ought to have.
So yeah, a fascinating number of layers to that. I think he said at some point the seriousness of purpose. So it's not just simply that you're busy because you're married or you have kids. I mean, any of us have had to raise kids or manage a marriage. No, it is time consuming, but it's that element he talked about, that seriousness of purpose being redirected. So I suppose really when you boil it down, it's been sort of a bait and switch, really, isn't it? We've moved from marriage and family to political activism and the intensity which comes with that. It's probably the final observation is the paradox. Of course, marriage and children draw people together because of that ferocious energy, whereas the ferocious energy of political activism is actually tearing people apart. I'm sure we talked about it a few weeks ago about how research is coming out of America showing that particularly young progressives, so those very much on the left, are saying they don't want to date anyone who's on the centre or the right. They don't want to talk to the uncle or aunt or even their parent if they don't agree with their political views. And that's coming almost exclusively from the left and far left, who I suspect are probably more likely to actually be the ones who are happy to switch marriage and family for political activism. And actually, that reminds me, I might just put this up, and I'll see if I can get a. Hopefully, you can see that, but this is a sense of meaninglessness, which basically shows if you are a liberal with very little religious or no religious belief, you have a very strong sense of meaninglessness. You can see that one right at the top, whereas at the bottom, where it says someone is conservative, religious, and has a much greater sense of meaning, where religion, faith, a belief is important. So this somewhat plays into what Weinstein is saying. So hopefully you can see that as well. For me, it's very small on the screen, which is why I'm struggling to read it. But hopefully you can see that there and realise that why you end up with groups in society who are not only lacking a sense of meaning, but are so aggressive. We obviously a lot of violence, particularly from the far left, not exclusively, but we're seeing a huge amount of violence come out of the left, while they're ironically, hypocritically talking about freedom and diversity and tolerance and all of that. But ultimately, I think Weinstein's right. He actually goes on in his discussion with Joe Rogan to talk about, granted, statements that Elon Musk came out that said AI is actually going to be so productive in the future that people aren't going to want for much. Now, I haven't fully understood his reasoning on that. I think there's been many false promises over the generations that the new technology will mean all of us can just sit at home happily, and the systems, robots, AI, whatever, are going to take care of everything, and we'll all have the money and lives that we want. I don't fully accept that. In fact, I don't really accept that at all. But if we do, and as Rogan and Weinstein were saying, well, that's going to be the same dynamic as the sexual revolution. If we don't have to go out and work, if we don't have to go and generate money and income, then where's that energy going to be directed? If we're not spending 40 plus hours a week working to earn the money to feed our families or to just look after ourselves, where's that energy going to be directed? So look, I think I'm probably over-egging it as typical from my side, but the basic premise from that discussion on Joe Rogan's show is fundamentally that if we're not directing our energies in one area, we direct them to another. And some people here might be going, well, that's perfectly fine. But I just think Weinstein was on to something there. And as I say, I think it's echoing a little bit of this as well, that the meaninglessness that comes into people's lives. Those who are less likely to see value in relationships, in marriage, in children, are more likely the ones who are going to pour their energy into whatever the current activist topic de rigueur is, be it again climate change or Palestine, or in this case in New Zealand the Treaty of Waitangi, or whatever. And yet they're going to be the ones that also find themselves more and more isolated from their family and friends. And like this survey, again, it was put in the Free Press, although the ones who have done the image, they're saying up there, for those who are very liberal and don't see religion as important, they are the ones. This is actually, I should actually have been quite specific. This was about 12th graders, so this is late teens. These are, and actually probably into the early 20s, I'd say. I'm just quickly trying to do the math in my head. So these are younger people. But those younger ones who are liberal and don't believe religion has any importance in their life are actually the ones who say they just don't have much sense of meaning at all. And I suppose what then comes from that is they have to try and find and create meaning either from within, so you become very self-indulgent, and in some ways that would reflect what we see in the trans movement at the moment. But on the other side too, they try to create meaning and purpose through their activism and finding a community there, which is why I'd say when you turn up to various protests, or as I've been in politics and been confronted with many protests, it's usually the same people. The topics just switch in and out, which at one level is quite funny, but if you accept the premise of this discussion today, if you don't have a faith, if you don't see value in relationship, in children, or even just building community, you find it in political activism. So yeah, a couple of last quick topics, because as usual I'm talking too much. This was in the paper the other day, actually. It was just after my Tuesday show. It's just another call here for New Zealand to introduce modern slavery legislation, and I highlight it here because I think it is well overdue. Some of you might know, actually, I had a modern slavery bill in the ballot when I was in Parliament. But sadly, certainly from my perspective, sadly it was never drawn out. And long and short, modern slavery exists. A little bit here in New Zealand, but more often it's in countries like China and Vietnam, Myanmar and elsewhere, where often children, actually I should rephrase that, where children, and often actually women, are basically working as slaves. When you buy that $1 mug or plate or tea towel, and even stuff that you're probably buying from Amazon or Temu or Alibaba, where's it been made? How's it been made? Not in each and every case, but modern slavery is a reality where other human beings are tied in to a system which exploits their labour. And in some ways it actually quickly jumps back to that discussion I had earlier about that Masa Al-Ghabi, the sociologist. He would say, oh, there'll be people out there protesting against modern slavery, but more than happy at the same time to take the cheap goods. That's not me. I just think modern slavery is a scourge. I think it's one way we actually hold autocratic and despotic regimes to account, and it's well past time New Zealand had this legislation. Disappointingly, the current government's done nothing. There's been, some talk about. I know Greg Fleming, a National MP, has been talking about. I think Helen White on Labour's been talking about it, but they hold no power in this case. It really comes down to the government. And I'll be honest with you, one of the great disappointments is that the current Prime Minister said this was the issue that he would march in the streets about, and yet nothing's been done. It's not a priority. And so I raise it here today because I want it to be a priority. It should be a priority. The government should basically just get on with it. It's not all that difficult, and what it requires is that firms operating here in New Zealand confirm and affirm that their supply chains are ethical, and if they're found to be in breach, they're slapped with huge fines. So really, it's not really a difficult thing. It's a no-brainer. So many other countries have modern slavery legislation. I mean, I'll be a little bit facetious here, but you just need to take the Australian law or the UK law and cross the word Australia out, put in New Zealand, and we're done. So it's actually not difficult. So good on, I think it's Morgan Theekson, for writing this op-ed. I think the more we can highlight that, the better. A reminder, as I wrap up, of course, we always have our morning shows. Bob will be with you live tomorrow. Tonight, now obviously I am not going to be there tonight. I've got a funeral I'll be attending, or probably the wake by this time. But Bob has a special guest. You'll have to tune in. You'll have to tune in from 5 o'clock tonight to see who, but it's a great guest. I'll give at least that away, there's a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, and I think he'll be a great guest on Political Playback. So that's 5 o'clock tonight. As always, I've got my RCR shows. If you jump over to rcr.media, you can check everything out there. And as always, a reminder that Bob is doing his Substacks as well, his McBlogs he publishes there. So look up Bob on substack.com, and you can look me up as well. I've got all my ones that I chat away with. And as I keep reminding everyone, happily, you can watch, read and listen. Family First has all this content. It's on YouTube, it's on our webpage. You can obviously view as you're doing now. You can go and read our commentary. In fact, you can access all of this through Spotify as well. So guys, there is just no shortage of material for you to access. But for now, I better, by the time this is going live, I'm probably only just waking up, actually. It's one of the reasons I had to do this as a pre-record. I knew that the time in Melbourne was going to be much, much earlier. So I'll be probably waking just after this is aired, and then get immediately ready to travel across to go to the funeral of my aunt. So look, thanks for joining me this morning. I look forward to reading your comments later in the day. And thanks, as always, for being part of Solid Ground.